everyone, it's Lowell and Deidre down here at Italian Cowboy in Rockport, Fulton, Texas. And today for our cooking class, we are going to be preparing one of our favorite comfort foods, risotto. So with that, Lowell is going to get started. He's just putting some olive oil into a nice kind of larger pot. We've got here, how many tablespoons of olive oil would you say that is?
I would say that's about 2, maybe 3 tablespoons of olive oil. A generous amount of olive oil, and we may add a little more as things move on, but that's sort of where we're starting.
Okay, great. All right, well, so Lola's gonna get that warming, and then we're going to add some onions and start sweating those onions down. Are you ready for the onions?
Perfect, ready for onions.
Ready for onions, okay. So let's talk about risotto. You know, I would say out of all of the products in the store, out of all of the different kinds of Italian foods out there, risotto is the one that, or one of the ones that we get probably the most comments on. And usually those comments come in the context of risotto is really hard, I've never been able to make it, people are hesitant to even try it. And when I look at a lot of the recipes floating around out there on the internet and so forth of risotto, I can absolutely understand why that is. They're very overcomplicated, and they make you think that you need to sit here and constantly stir, and that there's some type of magic technique involved in it. And it's simply not the case. The reality is with risotto, once you get a basic recipe for risotto down, it becomes a wonderful venue for so many different types of flavors and foods. Just like pasta, it's incredibly versatile. So what we're gonna do is prepare one recipe today, but we wanna talk you through the recipe and some of the tips and techniques so that you can take this and adapt it to many different types of ingredients you might have or want to use. And so with that, Lowell has started to sweat down about half an onion, roughly about 4 tablespoons. It really depends on your taste, but with risotto, you always start with a fat, butter or oil. In North Italy, you're usually going to find that they're going to start with butter a lot of times. We usually use olive oil because we don't always have butter on hand, but that's certainly up to you. But oil, some type of oil or fat, and onions is definitely the way to get started with any type of risotto. And I would say with about half an onion, roughly, I would say it takes about 5 to 6 minutes to sweat those onions down, get them nice and kind of cooked, and get that flavor kind of enhanced. What do you agree?
I completely agree. And while it is approximately 900 degrees here today, and so I'm sweating, when it comes to onions, what do we mean about sweating?
Oh, well, we mean that we're just going to, you're going to see, well, maybe we could show them.
Yeah, and what I'm going to try to do is, I'm going to try to do some fancy camera work today. We'll see if it works with our editing. But at the moment, we'll do, what we're doing here, which is sort of hold things up and let you look. Yeah. I may try to take some overhead pictures and splice those in. If it doesn't work, it's my editing skills, so forgive me. But what we're talking about, as Deidre mentioned, is just sort of basically getting the onions a little translucent. You're not trying to brown them. You're not trying to develop flavor you would if you were like saying make a French onion soup. You're just really trying to get the rawness out of them and get them sauteed down a little.
And get some of the water out.
Yeah, get some of the water out. And it sort of it depends, on how high your flame is, how much you sort of play with them, and again, it's again like almost anything, it's to taste. If you like your onions a little more raw, do them a little more raw. We're gonna saute these down for probably, like Deidre said, 4 or 5 minutes, just to get the rawness out of them. And in the meantime, I'm taking porcini mushrooms that we have soaked in water and chopping them up. The next step, as Deidre was probably about to tell you, is once you get these sauteed down, you're gonna put in what I would call your stuff. Here, the nice thing about porcini mushrooms is because they're dried and dehydrated and then redone, you can basically put them in and they're already cooked. If you had something like, I don't know, asparagus or something a bit more sturdy. If you were using not dried mushrooms, you'd want to put them in and cook them a little longer, because you want them to, again, as with the as with the onions, get the rawness out of them.
So for example, a lot of times when we prepare porcini mushroom risotto, we would put the oil in, put the onions in, and then put sliced cremini or button mushrooms in and cook those for about 7 minutes before adding the porcini mushrooms. We don't have those today, so we're not gonna worry about it. We're just gonna start with the universal step you should always start with, which is the oil or fat, we'll call it, because you could be using butter, your oil, your onion, and then use our other seasoning ingredients, which in this case is porcini mushrooms. And a lot of you might have seen these porcini. These are from the Piedmont, and these particular porcini mushrooms, they're very popular in northern Italian cooking. They impart a lot of earthy, delicious flavor, and we chose porcini not just because we love it and it's delicious, but because it's a way of talking about broth, because there's a lot of discussion and concern about broth and stock when you're talking about risotto. And one of the interesting things about porcini is by soaking the porcini mushrooms in water, you make your own stock, and it's loaded with flavor.
And so we've got the mushrooms sweated down. As you saw, I just took a picture. I'll sort of post these pictures alongside so you can sort of see how we've decided that it's time to move on to the next step. But the onions are pretty much sweated. We're gonna toss in the mushrooms and let them cook down for a moment. And what Deidre mentioned is, you know, the great thing about these porcinis is they make their own stock. They also make a saltless stock, and we'll talk about the importance of that in a moment. But what I'm doing with the stock is, you'll see that I'm just pouring it nice and slowly into my pan, because I want to heat this stock up, but I also want to make sure that if there's any little grit or grime on the mushrooms, that's not poured into our broth. These are really, really nice, high quality Italian porcini. They've been cleaned really well, but you can see there's still a little, I don't know, what we would call here stuff at the bottom.
Yeah,
so we're just going to pass on that and heat this broth up, because the next step after we get everything sauteed will eventually be to add this hot broth back in, and we'll want to not lower the temperature of the rice as it cooks too much, so we're getting that broth up to temperature.
And can we show that then?
Yep,
so
as you can see,
look how delicious that was.
Yeah, I mean, and frankly, this would be good as it is.
Yeah.
But we're going to use it to flavor our risotto.
That's another recipe for another class, but back to risotto.
And can you pass over the risotto?
I would be delighted. Okay, so risotto. Let's talk about rice. So when we talk about risotto, one of the aspects of risotto that is so important is the rice you use. While we are normally very big fans of, you know, take whatever you want, put your flavors in it, have a lot of versatility, when it comes to risotto, you really, to get the creaminess, if that's what you're wanting, you would need to use certain types of rice. And arborio is probably the most common in the States. You'll find it at most stores now. It's pretty widely available, and it's because of its kind of high starch content, it's going to help make that creamy risotto. Now we're using carnarole rice instead, along with violone nano. It's one of the preferred risottos used in Italy. If you can find it, it's what we sell in the store. That's why we have it. But certainly arborio would be fine as well.
Can I have a little more olive oil, please?
Absolutely.
So basically, we've got the mushrooms essentially cooked down. What we're going to do is throw in a little more olive oil, because the next step is we're going to put in 2 cups of the carnarole rice, but then give it a good saute. You want the rice to cook for a minute or two. You want it to cook in the oil and get it sort of nice and coated and nice and cooked before you begin adding the liquid. Then after that, we'll deglaze the pan. But this first step of getting the rice cooked is really, really critical to a good risotto. It essentially sets up the starches. The whole point of risotto is what you're doing is you're using the natural starches in the risotto rice to make a creamy sauce without the cream. And there's two important steps in this. One is to first give it a nice saute. It essentially preps the starches for being released into the liquid. And then the next step, which many of you know, is unlike where you make a regular white rice dish and you just put in a pre-measured amount of water and oil and just cover it and you're done. What you're going to do here is add the stock slowly over time. And what that does is it coaxes the starch out of the rice slowly, and it allows the sauce to really, really thicken. But this first step where you're sauteing is really, really critical.
Absolutely. And like just as we were saying, you start with the oil and the onions always. You always put the rice in and saute it for a minute or so before adding the stock. This is the other tip to making kind of foolproof risotto every single time, and regardless of whatever else you add to it, this step should never be skipped.
Yeah, and then what we're gonna do, and I think we've got our rice all set, is deglaze the pan first with some wine. What we've got here is a nice Friulian white. What we always say is, don't ever cook with anything you wouldn't drink. You don't want to get cooking wine. It's all salty and it's try not to get like the $2 wine. It's an ingredient in your food, and the better the ingredient, the better your food is going to be. I'm not saying go out and buy,
It doesn't have to be expensive.
It doesn't have to be expensive,
not what we're saying.
but it just has to be good and drinkable. And what we're gonna do is, you'll see now that the rice is, I'm gonna take a picture of this actually as well. I'll hold it up to the camera, but what you'll see is the rice is starting to get a little translucent around the edges. And that's actually the perfect time to add in the first deglaze, which is the wine. So we're gonna add the wine in and basically stir that around and let it cook until it's completely gone. The reason that you start with the wine is two things. One is because it's got alcohol in it. If you put it in a nice warm pan, most of that alcohol is gonna cook off because alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than water. If you were to put it in later on, once you've got the stock going in, you'll have a much more alcohol-y flavor. And we don't want the alcohol, we just want the flavor component from the wine. And what we're gonna do is make that almost completely disappear. You won't even be able to see it in the pan. I'll take a picture in a second, but you can see that basically there's almost no water left already, no liquid left from the wine. And then that's the right time to start adding your stock with our handy dandy ladle.
Absolutely. Ladle. Here you go.
So now that we've, like I said, gotten basically all of the liquid out, we're gonna add our first ladle full of stock.
And now certainly if you want to skip the wine step, you could. It's not required to make good risotto, but it is something that we find enhances the depth and the flavor. One other little tip is if you don't have any white wine and you find yourself in the middle of making risotto, we sometimes will reach for vermouth because that will produce also a very delicious risotto, we have found.
Yeah, exactly. Again, like a vermouth is just basically a seasoned wine, and so especially if you've got a vermouth that you're willing to drink, that would be a perfect substitute here. And again, if you don't want any wine, you could use more stock. You could just use water. Again, the question is, what flavor components are you adding? If you don't use wine, add a little more, herbs.
Yeah. Or cheese at the end.
Exactly.
There's a lot of different variations, so I think now's a good time to talk a little bit about stock. And I think that aside from the stirring and the kind of mystery of risotto being this difficult or supposedly difficult dish, one of the things that I read a lot or hear a lot is, well, you have to make your own stock, or you have to have an expensive stock, or this or that. And it's simply not true. You have different options with regard to the stock you choose. Today, we are obviously using the porcini stock because the porcini mushrooms are kind of two products in one, right? They produce the stock from the soaking, but also have the mushrooms themselves. That's not always going to be the case. For example, if you want to, you could use a chicken stock if you have that on hand, or a beef stock. But remember that your stock will concentrate flavor. So one of the concerns is those stocks will add salt. So you want to make sure that you adjust for that, because you're going to add, if you then add salt and you add a salted cheese, you could come out with perhaps a little more salt than you want. The truth of the matter is, a lot of times we use water as our stock, and you'll find that in Italy they'll use water a lot of times for risotto, especially depending on the dish or the type of flavoring they're going to use with the risotto. You could also use a bouillon cube. A lot of people have those on hand in their pantry. You could put that in some water and use that as well. You could certainly use a vegetarian stock. There's a lot of options.
Exactly.
out there.
And when you're talking about concentrating the flavor, you'll see when we're done how much volume of risotto we get. But you'll also see that by the time we're done, we've got 4 cups of broth here, we've got another 2 cups of water here. We will probably have ended up putting 6 cups in, and it will not just soak up, the rice will not only soak it up, and it will not only soak it up and create a sauce, but some of it's going to evaporate. One of the reasons we've got a pot here rather than a pan is we're really not aiming for evaporation, we're aiming for a nice slow soak. It's like more of a soak in a tub rather than a jacuzzi. You don't want it really hot, really fast. You want it nice and slow. I'm just getting like a little bubbling. By the time I lift it up, you'll see there's only a little bubbling. Because we're not trying to evaporate. Frankly, the more evaporation you have, the more liquid you're gonna have to put back in, and you don't wanna put back in too much salt or flavor. If you add 6 cups of beef broth and then go, oh, I gotta do another 2 cups, you're gonna have added 8 cups of beef broth. Your risotto is gonna taste like beef broth.
Yeah.
So if after you've added the amount of broth or that bouillon cube you want, then just switch to water. You can use a combination of stock and water, or bouillon cube and water.
And the great thing about risotto is, after you've done it a couple of times, after you've prepared this dish, you do begin to get an instinct for the way you like it prepared. If you like it a little bit thinner, a little bit thicker, if you like a little more onion, a little less onion, and what really is your preference is what you'll get the hang of it, you'll get the instinct. But one of the things you'll see here is that we're not constantly stirring. Again, you don't have to sit there and stir for 20 minutes and get your arm, well, that's a great arm workout, and that's all good. It's certainly not necessary. Right,
you can do it.
If you can't get to the gym, you can make risotto, but it's certainly not necessary. And you can, give it a little stir, go over, chop something else you might be preparing, and come back to it. So that's one thing that I want to point out, because I think that's one of the things that, in addition to overly complicated recipes, I think that is one of the things that discourages people from cooking risotto. So, wouldn't you agree?
I completely agree. Yeah, you don't have to sit here and stir it all the time. Because you've got so much liquid, the biggest concern you'd have is with stuff sitting at the bottom of the pan. And because you've got so much liquid, if stuff starts to stick to the bottom of the pan, just scrape it off next time you put a little more liquid in.
There's good flavor in those burnt bits. And so another thing, actually, in terms of tools, you will see is that we're using a wooden spoon. We recommend that for preparing risotto, you do use a wood spoon. Absolutely, it is the preferred kitchen tool. And one other thing in terms of tool recommendations, you'll see that we are going with like Lowell said, not a flat pan, and we're going with a little bit bigger of a pot than some folks might think. You're putting in this tiny little bit of rice, but it swells up just like polenta. It cooks up larger and swells up when it cooks.
Exactly.
And so you're going to end up with a lot of food. So you want to make sure you have a dish that accommodates it, not when it's dry, but when it's going to be wet. So just, a little bit bigger of a pot like this is fine. It doesn't have to be a special risotto pan. We hear that question a lot too. I've never owned a special risotto pan and have made risotto for 20 years. So don't buy anything that's special for it.
Exactly. This is a 4.5 quart pan, and it's big enough. But you'll see again, the liquid's completely gone. Mm-hmm. So that's why we're bringing more water to the equation here, broth to the equation, because we completely evaporated everything, and then so we'll put in another ladle of stock. As to the stock over here, we've got, it does look delicious. Mm-hmm. Even if it is 1,000 degrees, it still looks good. I know, right. And so what we've got with the stock is I've just got it warm. It's barely even, it's like not even simmering. I don't know if you can see it. I've got a slight steam coming off of it. I just want it warm enough so it doesn't completely lower the temperature of the risotto as it cooks. It comes back to a boil almost immediately, but you don't want this at a vigorous boil because all you're then doing is evaporating the water, and then you're gonna have to add more water to put it in. You just want it warm enough that it doesn't really drastically affect the cooking temperature of the risotto as it cooks.
Great point. That's a really good point. And, with regard to risotto, one of the things that I think people, when they think of Italian food, again, they often think of pasta. And in fact, rice is very, very common, particularly in North Italy. And you will find it both eaten and consumed and grown in North Italy. They actually produce a fair amount of very high quality rice in Italy, and it's very popular, particularly in the Lombardy region, in Milan, in the Veneto, and in Piedmont, all of those areas. You'll find risotto is one of the most common starches that they eat. It pairs wonderfully with mushrooms, if you're in Venice, with seafood. One of the reasons that risotto is a great thing to know how to make, especially down here in the coastal bend of Texas, is we have all of this amazing seafood, and risotto is a fantastic accompaniment to seafood, and is quite common in parts of Italy to be served with it. You wouldn't use the porcini mushrooms in that case. That's another variation of how you could prepare this, but just a little background on rice, because it is quite popular, and again, another gluten-free option. There's definitely a belief that Italian food is heavy or unhealthy or all about gluten, and this entire class will be gluten-free. So just a little bit of background there on rice.
Yeah, and what I'm going to try to do is take a little video. We'll see if this works, whether or not I can intersperse it, but you'll see we've got light bubbles, and I'm showing sort of how it's basically leaving a dry line through the risotto. As I pull it through, you'll see, it's basically leaving a dry line, and so that's time to add a little more stock, and it's coming along. Overall, again, this is like many things Italian. It's a question of sort of how well you want it done, right? The idea is not to have a mushy rice at the end. The idea is to have a rice that's got a little bite in the middle, and a nice creamy sauce. And so depending on how much bite you like, it takes a little longer or a little less time. To have it sort of what I would call almost a little chalky in the middle, like some people will like, it's about 18 to 20 minutes. Deidre and I like it about probably a little closer to 20 to 25 minutes. But two things. One is, one of the reasons we like the Carnaroli rice is it provides a little larger of a window where you get that sort of nice al dente in the middle. Arborio rice has a couple of minute window. Carnaroli rice has a little, 4 or 5 minute window. So again, don't feel like you have to babysit this. You can come back in 2 minutes, especially with the Carnaroli rice, and it's not gonna be a catastrophe if it's cooked a little more. And
Absolutely.
So we're just gonna continue to cook this down on a nice low heat. As we run out of our broth, we're gonna turn to water. We'll heat that up, and we'll just keep cooking for a little while. I don't know if we want to talk about variations now, or if we want to sort of cut away and come back.
We can, absolutely. We'll talk a little bit about variations, and just a couple quick tips I want to jump back to, because I think it's important, just like we say, start with your fat, and then add your onions, and then do your saute of the rice before you add the broth. All of those steps. And to Lowell's point, about 20 to 25 minutes, between 18 and 25 is how most risotto that's the cooking time for most of it. We start tasting it right about 20 minutes, I would say, because there can be some variation, it just like any dish. But also, when you're preparing it, you want to, get used to the ingredient. You want to, say, at 19 minutes, at 20 minutes, dip a little bit out and try it. See what it tastes like. Kind of not unlike what you would do with pasta, to see if it's al dente. And then it helps you to kind of get familiar with what the rice will taste like at those times, how done it is.
So for
And
example,
it
right now,
helps-
crunchy.
crunchy rice, which is fine, but that's not what we're aiming for. So we'll need to cook it a few more minutes. But the point being, you get a little bit of that that instinct, and to some degree, again, Italian cooking. You know, people will say, well, here's what the recipe says, and it's very rigid. And I think that that's another reason why folks kind of go, maybe their risotto doesn't work out because they're following a recipe and the recipe says 20 minutes, and so that's what they cook it for. But that recipe may be a different pot, a different kind of burner. Are you gas or electric, you know, or what do you have it set at? Is it 6 versus 5 on the oven? There's a lot of variation. So part of what we're trying to do here is to kind of give some of those tips to get y'all all cooking like an Italian grandma, so that you have those instincts and you can learn to trust your instincts rather than just say, well, the recipe says I have to cook it for this long, and I cooked it for that long and it didn't work out, and so gosh, I must have messed up. Well, you probably didn't. You know, it was probably, I mean, there are some not great recipes out there. So just know that, you know, part of it is just learning to trust your own instincts. Don't you think? Just
Yes.
getting familiar with the ingredients, trying them, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so we're coming along really well here, I think. And then, so variations. You're going to see that with this one, we're going to add some truffle at the end of it. So we're going to take, you know, definitely in our northern Italian kind of Piedmont flavors, we're going to stick with that theme for this dish. If you have some truffle salt, truffle oil, anything like that, porcini salt hanging out in your pantry, this is a great time to use that. When you want to add some salt, that's a great time to do that. Also, truffle oil pairs wonderfully with this. So this is one of those opportunities to use those ingredients. However, we will also be adding at the end, you will see we're also going to be adding a true Parmigiano Reggiano. We'll be using, as always, a 24-month age Parmigiano Reggiano. You could also add, and that's very important, you don't want to skip that step. We'll get to that in a moment, but you could also add Grana Padano, you could add Pecorino Romano, and one of Lowell's favorite cheese additions, which is blue cheese. A lot of people don't think about blue cheese in risotto, but that's certainly something that would be appropriate. So just a few little tips on kind of where we're going to take this dish, but also some other suggestions, because you may not have this particular thing in your fridge or your pantry, so we want to provide other suggestions. Another great tip would be if you decide, well, I don't like mushrooms, I don't want to do porcini, that's fine. This dish is a great place to use saffron. If you have saffron in your pantry, maybe you were making that paella, you have some saffron, you have that sitting in there, it would be very delicious and very authentic. You could serve that with some summer or spring veggies, some seafood. That would be fantastic, beautiful color. And then also, last but not least, since we are down here on the Gulf Coast, I should mention seafood. You could absolutely leave the mushrooms out, do the other steps, and then add lemon. You could add some peas, frozen peas would be fine. Asparagus, artichokes would all be very complimentary and wonderful, and would be a great thing to pair with shrimp or fish or any of our beautiful seafood down here in Rockport. So, but one thing you do want to think about is if you're adding some of those things, you're just going to toss in, say, asparagus or zucchini. You really want to add those things closer to the end, because if you were to add, say, zucchini, it's going to be cooked down to nothing. So you don't want to add that in the beginning. You know, like you could do spinach, you would want to add that at the end, as opposed to the mushrooms, like button mushrooms, that you'd want to add and sweat down at the beginning.
Yeah, the more sturdy the ingredient, the earlier it can go on.
Absolutely, it's a good rule of thumb. So just to I know it's a lot of information, but just to kind of give you some ideas for the ways that risotto can be used as a canvas for so many wonderful foods and seasonings, many of which you probably already have sitting in your pantry. So this would be a great venue for that.
Exactly, and what I think we should do right now is we're going to add a little salt into it.
Okay.
If you grab the truffle salt for me. Obviously, we've got a broth, If we season at the end, basically we're gonna have seasoned rice. If we throw in a little salt now, by seasoning the liquid, we're gonna be able to essentially infuse the liquid with the flavor, which means that we'll be able to infuse the rice with the flavor. So we've got about a half a teaspoon of truffle salt here, as Deidre mentioned. Again, as you've sort of seen from our cooking, we don't use a tremendous amount of salt. We actually will often have recipes where the herbs or the vegetables will serve, or frankly the olive oil will serve as the seasoning. But risotto is really one of those that does need some salt. We're gonna use a half a teaspoon. You may wanna use a teaspoon. You may wanna use some truffle salt and some regular salt because you don't want the seasoned salt to overpower it. But again, like Deidre said, taste it. If it doesn't taste salty enough, add a little salt.
Add to your
Everybody's
taste.
got different preferences on salt. And don't forget though, as Deidre mentioned, at the end of this, we're gonna be adding a 24-month-old Parmigiano Reggiano. It's got some decent amount of salt in it, so you may wanna start with this a little under-seasoned, and at the very end, after the Parmigiano's in, if you still find it a little under-seasoned, you can sort of modify it at that time.
Absolutely. So how are we coming over here?
We're doing well. You can see that the rice is really getting voluminous. We're sort of getting a nice creamy sauce. We're gonna probably in a second or two add a little more broth. Actually, you'll see that we're actually up to the water stage. And as with everything, it does smell great, doesn't it? What we're gonna do is add a little more, and we're probably getting there. I don't know what the timer over there says, but my guess is we're probably close to 18 to 20 minutes, which for Deidre and me is getting close to done, but not completely done.
Okay.
So what we are gonna do is keep simmering down, keep adding our broth. It's a good Sunday evening, Sunday afternoon little test.
Absolutely.
Or if you're home doing nothing.
Absolutely. Did you wanna, are we gonna?
Yeah, we're gonna take a break and we'll come right back.
Absolutely. Looks.
Okay, so we're back.
Hello everyone. We are back with a very delicious risotto.
Exactly.
Ready to eat.
Yeah, so I think we're all done. You can see that we've got a nice creamy risotto. Obviously no cream at all. We're gonna add a little Parmigiano to it. And again, this is sort of to taste. What we've got here is a generous amount of Parmigiano, probably, 3 or 4 ounces that we've shredded down. We're just gonna sort of put this in. Some of it goes onto the stovetop, some of it goes into the pan, hopefully more in the pan than on the stovetop.
Cooking can be messy sometimes.
Yes.
That's just the reality.
Again, I'm not the cleaner, so. So we'll just stir that in here, as you'll see, and it'll pretty quickly melt in. We're off heat now. There's really no reason. There's so much residual warmth in the risotto that you don't need to be on heat for this. So we've now just got a nice, really creamy risotto with just a small amount of dairy in. Otherwise, as you saw, all the cream is created by the arborio starch. So what we'll do is plate a little here so you can see the nice creaminess. We've got some fresh herbs that we'll be topping it with. And you know, this can be a dish in of itself, or this would be a fabulous side dish. If you did, you know, this would be delicious alongside, you know, some slow cooked meat. It would be a wonderful side dish for things like roasted winter vegetables. You could do almost anything you want with it. And what we'll do with this is we'll put it into a large pan, we'll cut it into little pieces, and then we'll reheat it. When you reheat it, you'll need a little more water. So just add a little water either to a pan or to, you know, if you're gonna microwave it, I guess you could do that. Just add a little extra water before you reheat it. But otherwise, it's, you know, fantastic. The wine pairing with this would either be, if you wanted a white, the Friuliano that we started cooking with would be wonderful, or because we've got a lot of earthiness in the mushrooms, we've got another Friulian wine here. It's a Ribolla Nera. It's a nice darker wine, but it's got a lot of sort of earthy notes, a little balsamic notes to it. It's a little less fruity and a little more earthy, which pairs really well with the mushrooms.
Absolutely. Risotto, red, white, bubbly, can't go wrong.
Exactly. So we hope this is somewhat demystified risotto. And as we said, it's just sort of a blank canvas for almost anything that you would put in it. And it's just creamy and delicious.
Yeah, and I think just the takeaway is remembering kind of those main tips of start with the fat, sweat down the onions, saute the rice before adding the broth. You'll probably go between 20 to 25 minutes, and you'll use roughly 5 to 6 cups of stock. And that, remember, you can be flexible in your stock. It's not as rigid as a lot of the recipes and the information floating around there would have you believe. And a great versatile dish that, as you can see, those little cups of rice cook up to this huge amount of food. So we hope this has been helpful and demystified a lot of the risotto concerns out there. So I guess that's it. I think it's time to eat some risotto. We've got it here with a little parsley, little green herbs on it that we picked from our little flower pot, and I think it's ready to eat some risotto.
I think so. And now that it's turning into summer here on the Gulf Coast, I think next week may very well be mint.
I think that's a fabulous idea. I love mint. So until then, thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.